Mayday! Mayday! This is the Arctic Pearl. Dawn's voice crackled through the radio, raw with desperation. We're taking on Waterdeck 7 is flooding. The transmission cut to static. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze in the North Atlantic darkness. The rescue coordinator's hands trembled over the controls. Arctic Pearl, this is Coast Guard Station Halifax. What is your position? Arctic Pearl, respond. But there was only silence. 37 minutes earlier, Dawn Jankovic had been confidently navigating through what she called moderate seas. The luxury expedition vessel Arctic Pearl was carrying 142 passengers through the infamous Drake Passage, known as the most treacherous waters on Earth. Dawn, with 23 years of maritime experience, had crossed these waters dozens of times. She was the captain other captains consulted, the navigator who could read the ocean like a book. In the ship's conference room, passenger Michael Chen was recording his travel vlog. His camera captured Dawn's last briefing. These waters demand respect, but they're not unconquerable. The Arctic Pearl was built for conditions far worse than this. Behind her, through the windows, waves the size of buildings rolled past in the darkness. The first impact came at 11:47 p.m. Not from above, but from below. A grinding, tearing sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. In less than 90 seconds, the unsinkable Arctic Pearl would begin its death spiral. Dawn Jankovic would spend her final moments not on the bridge where she belonged, but trapped in the flooding lower decks, trying to save passengers who should never have been there. March 15, 2023. Southern Ocean, 47 degrees south. They called it the Roaring Forties, where waves reach 40 feet and winds scream at 70 knots. Where the ocean shows what it truly is: untamable, unforgiving, absolute. Dawn Jankovic thought she knew these waters. She thought wrong. You're watching Maritime Mysteries Uncovered. If this story grips you, subscribe, like, and share, because what you're about to witness is only the beginning. Dawn Jankovic wasn't just a ship captain. She was the captain the one maritime academies invited to guest lecture, the one documentary crews followed through hurricanes, the one who had never lost a vessel in 23 years of commanding everything from research vessels to luxury cruise liners. To her crew, she was unshakable. To her passengers, she was a guardian. To the ocean, she was just another human who had forgotten her place. Dawn started her maritime career at 19, working on fishing trawlers in the North Sea. Her father, a Croatian fisherman, had taught her to read weather patterns before she could read books. "The sea doesn't lie," he'd tell her. "It always shows you what it's planning. You just have to know how to look." By 25, she had her captain's license. By 30, she was commanding research vessels in Antarctica. By 40, she was one of the most respected expedition cruise captains in the industry. The Arctic Pearl represented Dawn's greatest achievement. A state-of-the-art expedition vessel launched in 2021, it combined luxury amenities with ice-class construction and advanced navigation systems. Dawn had been instrumental in its design, insisting on safety features that exceeded international requirements. Triple redundant navigation systems, reinforced hull plating, advanced stabilizers. She called it the safest vessel ever to cruise polar waters. Her colleagues called her the Ice Queen, not for coldness, but for her ability to navigate polar waters others wouldn't dare enter. Dawn had successfully traversed the Northwest Passage 17 times, rescued 3 vessels from ice entrapment, and held the record for the southernmost navigation by a passenger vessel. She wrote articles about respectful navigation and reading the ocean's language. But success bred overconfidence. In recent years, Dawn had begun taking risks that worried even her most experienced officers. She would maintain speed in conditions that called for caution, navigate closer to ice fields than recommended, push weather windows that others would wait out. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive," she'd tell concerned crew members. "I know what this ship can handle." First Officer James Patterson had sailed with Dawn for 7 years. She was brilliant, but had developed a dangerous belief in her own intuition over instruments, he later testified. She'd override weather routing suggestions, dismiss ice warnings, trust her feel for the ocean over radar data. We all respected her experience, but the ocean doesn't care about your resume. The voyage that would be her last began in Ushuaia, Argentina, on March 10, 2023. The Arctic Pearl was undertaking a 21-day expedition to Antarctica, crossing the notorious Drake Passage 600 miles of open ocean between South America and Antarctica, where 3 oceans converge, creating some of Earth's roughest seas. Dawn had crossed it 47 times. She called it her old friend. Passenger manifests showed 142 souls aboard, including several elderly passengers and families with children, unusual for such an extreme expedition. When questioned about the passenger mix, Dawn dismissed concerns. "The Arctic Pearl can handle anything the Drake throws at us. These people deserve to see Antarctica's wonders, regardless of age." The weather forecast for March 15 showed a significant low-pressure system developing, with predicted seas of 35-40 feet and winds gusting to 70 knots. Standard protocol would be to delay departure or take the longer, calmer route. Dawn chose neither. "We've handled worse," she announced at the crew briefing. "The Arctic Pearl was built for this." Chief Engineer Svetlana Volkov raised concerns about recent maintenance issues. The port stabilizer had been showing intermittent failures. Several watertight doors had failed recent pressure tests. The emergency generator had a persistent fuel leak. "These are not critical issues," Dawn declared. "We have redundancies for our redundancies." But redundancies mean nothing when cascading failures begin. The investigation would later reveal that Dawn had been under immense pressure from the cruise line to maintain schedules. Delays meant tens of thousands in port fees and passenger compensations. The company's emails, recovered from the ship's servers, showed increasingly aggressive demands to maintain commercial viability and trust in the vessel's capabilities. Dawn's personal life added another layer of pressure. Her mother was terminally ill in Croatia, and Dawn had promised to complete this voyage in time to see her. Her marriage had ended 6 months earlier, partly due to her increasing absence and risk-taking behavior. She was isolated, exhausted, and making decisions based on emotion rather than evidence. On the morning of March 15, Dawn stood on the bridge, watching the barometer drop precipitously. The ocean was black glass, that deceptive calm that precedes Southern Ocean storms. Experienced mariners call it the devil's mirror, beautiful, peaceful, and absolutely terrifying to those who know what it means. Second, Officer Maria Santos approached with the latest weather update. The system was intensifying faster than predicted. Wave heights were already exceeding forecasts. 3 vessels had already diverted to shelter. Santos suggested they do the same. Dawn studied the data for a long moment, then made the decision that would kill her and 14 others. "We proceed as planned. The Arctic Pearl can handle this." It was hubris disguised as confidence, and the ocean was about to teach its final lesson. The Arctic Pearl was marketed as the pinnacle of maritime engineering, a vessel that could dance with icebergs and waltz through hurricanes. But beneath its gleaming exterior and luxury appointments lay a ship compromised by cost-cutting measures, deferred maintenance, and design flaws that turned it from a fortress into a tomb. Built in 2021 at the Eastern Shipyards in South Korea, the Arctic Pearl was part of a new generation of expedition cruise vessels designed to access extreme destinations while providing 5-star comfort. The marketing materials boasted of its Polar Class 6 ice-strengthened hull, dynamic positioning systems, and state-of-the-art safety features. What they didn't mention were the compromises made during construction to meet budget constraints. The shipyard had been under intense pressure to deliver on schedule. Delays meant penalties of 100 per day. Inspectors later found evidence of rushed work, improperly sealed bulkheads, substandard welding on critical joints, and stabilizer systems that hadn't completed full testing cycles. The ship passed its initial certifications, but only because inspectors were shown carefully selected areas and documentation. More troubling was the vessel's fundamental design. To maximize passenger capacity and comfort, the Arctic Pearl featured an unusually high superstructure relative to its beam. This gave it more deck space and better views, but also a higher center of gravity. In calm seas, this wasn't a problem. In the massive swells of the Southern Ocean, it created a pendulum effect that put enormous stress on the hull and stabilizer systems. The stabilizer issue was particularly critical. These fin-like projections extend from the hull to counteract rolling motion. The Arctic Pearl's stabilizers were undersized for a vessel of its height and weight distribution, a cost-saving measure that saved $2 million during construction. The manufacturer had recommended larger units, but the cruise line overruled them, trusting computer models that assumed moderate sea conditions. By March 2023, these stabilizers were already showing signs of failure. Hydraulic leaks had been patched rather than properly repaired. Control sensors gave intermittent false readings. The port stabilizer had a damaged actuator that caused it to respond sluggishly to commands. The crew had learned to compensate manually, but this required constant attention and perfect timing luxuries that wouldn't exist in crisis conditions. The watertight door system represented another critical vulnerability. Modern ships are divided into compartments by watertight bulkheads, with heavy doors that can seal these sections in emergencies. The Arctic Pearl had 47 such doors, but budget constraints had led to installing a cheaper hydraulic system rather than the recommended independent mechanical closures. This meant all doors operated from a central hydraulic plant. If that system failed, the doors couldn't be closed manually without significant delay. Internal emails between Chief Engineer Volkov and the cruise line's technical department revealed growing concerns. These doors are taking 45-60 seconds to close instead of the required 30, Volkov wrote. In an emergency, that delay could be catastrophic. The response was telling: monitor the situation. Full system replacement scheduled for next dry dock. That dry dock was still 4 months away. The emergency generator, supposedly the ship's last line of defense, had its own problems. Located on Deck 8, it was designed to automatically start if main power failed. But a persistent fuel leak had contaminated its compartment with diesel fumes. The ventilation system, another casualty of cost-cutting, couldn't clear these fumes effectively. The generator would start, but whether it would keep running was a gamble. Perhaps most damning was the ballast system modification made in January 2023. To improve passenger comfort in rough seas, the cruise line had approved a software update that allowed faster ballast transfers between tanks. This would theoretically allow the ship to adjust its trim more quickly, reducing motion, but the modification hadn't been properly tested in extreme conditions. Under severe stress, the system could become confused, pumping ballast in ways that would worsen rather than improve stability. The crew knew about many of these issues, but had learned to work around them. They developed informal protocols, unmarked in any manual, for handling the ship's quirks. The port stabilizer needed a manual override every few hours. Watertight doors required individual checking because the sensor system was unreliable. The emergency generator needed its compartment ventilated manually before testing. These workarounds created a dangerous illusion of safety. As long as conditions remained within normal parameters, the crew could compensate for the vessel's deficiencies. But emergencies don't allow for careful manual interventions. They demand systems that work instantly, automatically, and reliably. The Arctic Pearl had none of these. Captain Dawn Jankovic was aware of these issues, but had developed what investigators would later call normalization of deviance. Because nothing catastrophic had happened despite these problems, she began to see them as acceptable risks rather than critical vulnerabilities. Her confidence in her ability to handle any situation blinded her to the reality that some situations exceed human capability to manage. On March 14, the day before the disaster, several passengers reported unusual noises from the lower decks, metallic groaning sounds that seemed to come from the hull itself. These reports were dismissed as normal, ship sounds in heavy seas. But analysis of recovered recordings would later reveal these were stress fractures developing in the hull plating near frame 42, exactly where substandard welding had been concealed during construction. The Arctic Pearl wasn't just a ship with problems. It was a collection of problems held together by competent crew and favourable conditions. On March 15, 2023, when those favourable conditions ended, the truth about the Arctic Pearl would be written in the language of physics, and physics doesn't accept workarounds, experience, or confidence as substitutes for proper engineering. The cruise line marketing for the Arctic Pearl's Antarctic expedition promised an adventure of a lifetime and intimate encounters with nature's raw power. But internal company documents revealed a darker agenda, pushing operational limits to maximize profits, concealing safety concerns from passengers, and gambling with lives for commercial advantage. Paradise Expeditions Limited, the Arctic Pearl's operator, was hemorrhaging money. 3 years of pandemic restrictions had decimated the cruise industry. The company had borrowed heavily to survive, and creditors were demanding results. The Antarctic season of 2023 wasn't just important, it was existential. Every cancelled voyage meant potentially fatal financial consequences. CEO Marcus Webb had sent a memo to all captains in February 2023. Commercial considerations must be balanced with safety, but we cannot afford excessive caution. Our competitors are operating. Our ships must operate. Weather windows that might have seemed marginal in the past must be reconsidered in light of current financial realities. The pressure was particularly intense for the Arctic Pearl, the company's newest and most expensive vessel. At $180 million, it represented nearly half the company's asset value. It needed to generate 50 per day just to cover financing costs. Every day in port was a day losing money. This financial desperation led to disturbing decisions. The passenger manifest for the March 10 voyage included 23 individuals who should never have been cleared for Drake Passage crossing. Medical records, hidden from Captain Jankovic, showed passengers with serious heart conditions, mobility limitations, and age-related vulnerabilities that made them unsuitable for extreme expedition cruising. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the ship's physician, had raised concerns. We have 3 passengers over 80, 1 with a pacemaker, 2 using walkers, and a family with children under 10, she wrote in an email to company headquarters. The Drake Passage is no place for these individuals. The response was chilling. Passenger fitness is determined by their willingness to sign waivers, not medical opinion. The company had also been deliberately misleading about weather conditions. Marketing materials described March as optimal for Antarctic viewing with generally calm conditions. In reality, March sees some of the year's worst storms as seasons transition. The company knew this, but needed to fill cabins during the shoulder season. Insurance fraud was another shadow hanging over the voyage. The Arctic Pearl was insured for $200 million, $20 million more than its actual value. Documents would later reveal discussions about maximizing insurance recovery should an incident occur. While stopping short of suggesting deliberate sabotage, the company had created conditions where a catastrophic incident might be financially advantageous. The crew situation was equally troubling. To cut costs, Paradise Expeditions had reduced crew numbers by 15% from recommended levels. Critical positions were doubled up. Engineers pulled navigation watches, deck officers managed passenger services. Fatigue was chronic. The International Maritime Organization recommends maximum 14-hour shifts. Arctic Pearl crew routinely worked 18-20 hours during sea days. Training had been slashed. New crew members received 3 days of orientation instead of the standard 2 weeks. Emergency drills were performed monthly rather than weekly. The last full abandoned ship drill with passengers had been simulated rather than performed because it would disturb the passenger experience. Most disturbing was the suppression of previous incidents. The Arctic Pearl had experienced 2 serious near misses in its 18 months of operation. In September 2022, stabilizer failure in the Norwegian Sea had caused a 47-degree roll that injured 11 passengers. In December 2022, an engine room fire had nearly spread to fuel tanks before being contained. Neither incident was reported to maritime authorities. Passengers were compensated with non-disclosure agreements. Captain Jankovic was caught in an impossible position. Her employment contract included performance bonuses tied to schedule adherence and passenger satisfaction scores. Delays or cancellations would impact not just her income, but her professional reputation. The company had made it clear that captains who couldn't maintain schedules would be replaced by those who could. Communication protocols had been compromised for commercial reasons. Weather routing services that might recommend delays were cancelled as unnecessary expenses. Satellite communication was limited to reduce costs, making real-time weather updates sporadic. The ship's weather radar, damaged in January, hadn't been repaired because parts were on order, a lie to defer expenses, until the next fiscal year. The passenger briefings were carefully scripted to minimize concern while maximizing legal protection. Passengers were told about exciting conditions and authentic expedition experiences while being made to sign waivers, absolving the company of liability for acts of nature and inherent risks of closed ocean travel. The briefings never mentioned the vessel's mechanical issues or reduced crew levels. On March 13, 2 days before disaster, the Arctic Pearl's officers held an unofficial meeting in Chief Officer Patterson's cabin. The discussion, recorded secretly by Second Officer Santos, revealed deep concerns. "This is insane," Patterson said. "We're heading into a Force 10 storm with compromised stabilizers and elderly passengers. Someone's going to die." "Dawn knows the risks," Santos replied, "but she's convinced she can handle it, and corporate has made it clear what happens to captains who don't deliver." The meeting ended without resolution. The officers were trapped between loyalty to their captain, duty to their passengers, and fear for their careers. They chose silence, a decision that would haunt the survivors forever. On the morning of March 15, as the barometer plummeted and seas built, Paradise Expeditions executives were in a board meeting discussing the Arctic Pearl's excellent occupancy rates and projected revenues. They were congratulating themselves on aggressive scheduling and market confidence when the first distress signal crackled across the maritime emergency frequency. March 15, 2023, 11:00 p.m. The Arctic Pearl pitched and rolled in seas that had grown from impressive to terrifying in just 3 hours. Waves towered 50 feet above the deck, their crests blown horizontal by 75-knot winds. In the main lounge, unsecured furniture had become lethal projectiles. In their cabins, passengers who had paid for adventure were praying for survival. Captain Dawn Jankovic stood on the bridge, her knuckles white as she gripped the console. The ship's motion was violent, unpredictable. Every wave impact sounded like a giant's fist pummeling the hull. The inclinometer showed rolls exceeding 35 degrees, dangerous for any vessel, potentially fatal for one with the Arctic Pearl's stability issues. "Port stabilizer is not responding," Chief Officer Patterson shouted over the howling wind. "We're getting error codes across the board." Dawn's mind raced through options, but physics was already writing the outcome. Without the port stabilizer, the ship couldn't counter its rolling motion. Each wave pushed them further off balance, and recovery took longer. It was a death spiral in slow motion. At 11:17 p.m., the ballast system initiated an automatic correction sequence, the same modified software that had never been tested in extreme conditions. Instead of countering the roll, it began pumping ballast to the wrong tanks. The ship developed a list that grew worse with each wave cycle. Manual override, Dawn commanded, but the system wouldn't respond. The software modification had created a feedback loop, interpreting the ship's rolling as incorrect sensor data and correcting by making the problem worse. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Volkov and his team fought desperately to maintain power. The violent motion had ruptured fuel lines. Automatic shutdowns were triggering faster than they could reset systems. They were one major roll away from complete blackout. At 11:32 p.m., it happened. A massive wave, estimated at 65 feet, struck the Arctic Pearl broadside. The ship rolled 52 degrees to starboard. In the engine room, the main generators tore from their mountings. The lights went out. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow. The emergency generator should have started automatically. It tried, but the fuel leak contamination in its compartment caused it to sputter and die after just 30 seconds. The Arctic Pearl was now without power in the worst possible conditions. Without power, the watertight doors couldn't be closed. The hydraulic system was dead. Crew members tried to close them manually, but the modified quick-release mechanisms required tools and time they didn't have. Water began flooding through doors that should have sealed automatically. At 11:41 p.m., the catastrophic hull breach occurred. The stress fractures near frame 42, weakened by substandard welding and pounded by hours of massive waves, finally gave way. A crack 6 feet long opened in an instant. The Southern Ocean, at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, began flooding Deck 3 at 400 gallons per second. Dawn grabbed the radio, switching to battery backup. "Mayday, Mayday, this is the Arctic Pearl. Position 57 degrees 14 minutes south, 65 degrees 38 minutes west. Major flooding, no power. Request immediate assistance." The response was heartbreaking. The nearest vessel was 8 hours away. In these conditions, the Arctic Pearl had perhaps 30 minutes. "All passengers and crew to muster stations," Dawn announced over the battery-powered PA system. But chaos had already taken hold. In the darkness, with the ship rolling violently and listing increasingly to starboard, passengers couldn't find their way. Many were injured, thrown against bulkheads, or trapped under shifted furniture. Dawn made a captain's decision that would define her final moments. Instead of remaining on the bridge, she headed below to Deck 3, where elderly passengers were trapped in flooding cabins. "The captain doesn't leave until everyone is safe," she told Patterson, handing him command. "Get everyone you can to the lifeboats." The scene on Deck 3 was apocalyptic. Water was already waist-deep and rising fast. Emergency lighting had failed. Dawn waded through the freezing water, guided only by a flashlight, pulling passengers from cabins. She found the Hendersons, an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, trapped behind a jammed door. Using a fire axe, Dawn smashed through the door. "Come on, we need to move." But Mr. Henderson had broken his hip in the rolling. Dawn, all 5'6" of her, somehow carried him through the flooding corridor while Mrs. Henderson clung to her shoulder. They made it to the stairs, but water was rising faster than they could climb. Dawn pushed the Hendersons ahead. "Go, don't stop." Behind them, the corridor where they'd just been disappeared under black water. At 11:47 p.m., Dawn made her last radio transmission. Arctic Pearl to all stations. We are abandoning ship, launching lifeboats. Tell my mother, the transmission cut to static. The ship was now listing 40 degrees and accelerating its roll. Launching lifeboats in these conditions was nearly impossible. 3 boats were smashed against the hull by waves. 2 launched successfully, but immediately capsized in the mammoth seas. Only one, Lifeboat 7, managed to deploy correctly and remain upright. Dawn was helping load passengers into the last functional lifeboat when she saw them, a mother and 2 children, trapped on the wrong side of the tilting deck, sliding toward the railing and the black ocean beyond. Without hesitation, Dawn let go of the lifeboat ladder and lunged across the slanted deck. She caught the youngest child, a girl maybe 7 years old, just as she was about to slide under the railing. "Hold on to me!" Dawn shouted, grabbing the mother with her other hand. The older child clung to his mother's back. Together, they tried to climb back up the increasingly vertical deck. They almost made it. Dawn had pushed the family up to waiting crew members when the ship lurched to its final roll. The deck became a wall. Dawn lost her grip and fell backward into the flooding interior of the ship. The last anyone saw of Captain Dawn Jankovic, she was still trying to swim toward trapped passengers, visible through a submerged window. At 11:58 p.m., the Arctic Pearl capsized completely. The hull, never designed to be inverted, catastrophically failed. The ship broke in half and sank in less than 90 seconds. Of 142 souls aboard, only 31 made it into Lifeboat 7. In 50-foot seas and hurricane-force winds, they drifted for 14 hours before rescue. Dawn Jankovic's body was never recovered. The Hendersons, the elderly couple she saved, survived. So did the mother and her 2 children, the last people Dawn helped before her fall. They would spend the rest of their lives telling the story of the captain who chose their lives over her own. The investigation that followed revealed everything: the mechanical failures, the corporate pressure, the normalized deviance, the cascading errors that turned a preventable tragedy into inevitable disaster. Paradise Expeditions declared bankruptcy within weeks. Criminal charges were filed against executives who had knowingly sent an unseaworthy vessel into lethal conditions. But the real lesson of the Arctic Pearl went deeper than corporate greed or mechanical failure. It was about the dangerous delusion that humans can master forces beyond their control. Dawn Jankovic was brilliant, experienced, and courageous. She was also fatally wrong about her ability to outsmart the ocean. Today, a memorial in Ushuaia bears her name and a simple inscription: Captain Dawn Jankovic. She stayed at her post, but those who knew her, who sailed with her, who survived because of her, remember something else. They remember that in her final moments, when she had to choose between her own survival and her duty to others, Dawn Jankovic proved what kind of captain she really was. The ocean took her, as it takes all who forget its power, but it couldn't take her honor. In the end, that's all any of us can hope for: to face our final storm with courage, to choose others over ourselves, and to be remembered not for how we failed, but for how we tried. If you were moved by this story, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you dramatic recreations of true maritime disasters that deserve to be remembered, understood, and learned from. Like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. And remember, the ocean doesn't care about your experience, your technology, or your confidence. Respect the sea, or become part of its history. We'll see you in the next episode.